The AIPCT, American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought, was founded when the Dewey Center was defunded. And this was to serve as, and still does serve as, a sort of an anchor place for people who visit from all over to have a place to study, and a lot of them stay here and live here, and sometimes for up to a year. That has happened. Actually beyond a year in a few cases. And so when the Dewey Center went dark, it was really necessary, because people come from all over the world to see the Dewey papers at the Morse Library. For us to do something, there were no sort of quarters in or around the philosophy department. And so John Shook had the idea, sitting here in my living room, why don't you turn your house into, into an institute? At which point I asked my spouse, and she said, sure. Now, I'm not sure that many spouses would agree to that sort of thing. At that point, this place only had about 13,000 books in it. Now it's more like 35,000. And the collection has now gelled around the history of American thought, but it's also cultural thought, so it's not just philosophy. It's anything that would probably count as theory or thought in all of the humanities and social sciences. And so the collection developed along those lines, and many, many people have given us their books, and you can find some of them, although we haven't registered all of them yet, on our website. If you look under Holdings, on that tab, you'll see what's here. You were here for a whole semester, weren't you guys? Yeah, it's like you did your sabbatical here. Changed your life, in fact. You became irrelevant. He got interested in the St. Louis Hegelians, and it has dominated his life. But anyway, which is an interesting thing to get interested in. So in any case, several fellows here tonight: Gary Herstein, Laura Mueller, and my co-director Larry Hickman, who is very helpful with us, and who in fact gave the first and the inaugural lecture for this in 2016. What we are doing tonight is observing the 7th year of the AIPCT with Scott's lecture. And so if you go to our YouTube channel, our videographer, Troy Brown, he makes fabulous videos, and they're very popular, especially given the nature of, I mean, you know, they're all an hour and 15 minutes long. It's like, who watches an hour and 15? But our average viewing time is over 15 minutes on YouTube, and I am told that that's extraordinary. And so, and there are thousands and thousands of views. And so, so in any case, over the last 7 years, one of the things that we have done is we've done conferences, we've done seminars, we've done numerous public lectures. And there's a very active educational and intellectual exchange that goes on here. We do reading groups, fall and spring always, and sometimes summer as well. And we don't record those and put them up online because we're afraid people won't talk. If they know that you'll be watched by thousands of people, you can't, you know, say just whatever pops into your head. But in any case, it's a busy place, and it's a happy place, and it's happier now that we have a Dewey Center again. This is very good. Matt is over there receiving people at University Hall. Apparently there was a problem with with the people who were supposed to be there to receive. So the director of the Dewey Center is now a hotel clerk for the evening. Wishes he could be here, since his regrets. But with people coming in from all over the place this evening, it's more important that there be somebody there who can get them into their rooms. I know that many of you traveled incredible distances from China and India and Jersey. So, I mean, you know, there's exotic places like that. But I welcome you here, and after Scott's talk, I'll lead a tour around the place, tell you about the holdings, and tell you anybody who wants to stay. And there'll be food and boisterous hilarity and joviality and other sorts of what's the word I'm looking for?
Bon vivant.
Bon vivant. Yeah, there's going to be a nice reception in Scott's honor. And so, on behalf of John Shook and my co-director Larry Hickman, I'm going to welcome you, Scott. Now, that's about us. How about Scott? Scott is an unusual beast. he comes of a number of hybrid. So he's a hybrid beast because you can't confine this guy in one discipline, no way. And he's interested in what he's interested in, and he goes after it. And it turns out that at some point along the way, and you told me the story, but I won't repeat it. You may tell it tonight. At some point along the way, Ambedkar got your attention. It's like, what's going on with this? And when he's like a terrier when he gets onto the pant leg of a philosophical idea, and so a terrier never lets go. And so I want to introduce to you one of my favorite philosophical terriers, this is Scott Stroud from UT Austin. Please make him feel welcome.
All right. Thank you, Randy. Try not to chew up the furniture or anything. And thank you and the Institute, Larry and the folks running the Institute, for having me as the giver of the annual lecture. This is an important story. Bhimrao Ambedkar, you'll learn a lot about him today if you don't already know about him. He changed kind of my life and my scholarly trajectory. In some ways, his form of pragmatism is always the kind of pragmatism I tried to squeeze out of Dewey, if you look back at my Dewey and the Artful Life book from right out of grad school. So how I got interested in this was just one of these interesting kind of twists of fate. I was holding a student conference when I was a grad student back in 2004, I believe. Martha Nussbaum was the keynote speaker, so I was making sure she found her way from the car to where we needed to hear a great, profound lecture. And she knew I was doing my dissertation on Dewey with Schusterman, and she asked me, "Hey, have you ever heard of this guy, a student of Dewey's named Ambedkar, from India?" Now, I was interested in India. I was writing on the Gita and Vedanta in my spare time. So, this piqued my interest, but I was a grad student, so I knew a lot more then, and I think I knew a lot more then than I do now. So at any rate, I was very confident, and so I brushed it off. If I needed to learn about anyone, it's the master, not the disciple. And so I let this Ambedkar name drop. And then 10 years later, as we always do when you're supposed to be doing this project, you start looking at other things, and just hopefully you don't start renovating a car or a house or something. So I started Googling this guy named Ambedkar in 2014. And I just found, where other people had seen Dewey in his work. And I started to see things, to see Dewey, in other words, where other people hadn't seen Dewey. And I said, I know a bit about Dewey. I know a bit about Jainism and Indian thought and Vedanta and such. And, I might be able to tell this story. And so that initiated about a 10-year process where I started trying to go as deep as I can on this relationship between the teacher, John Dewey, and his student at Columbia University, Bhimrao Ambedkar. It's a story that a lot of people have heard of. If they know of Ambedkar, they know one of his favorite teachers was Dewey, but it's a story no one has any details on. They'll give you one paragraph or one article, but no one can drill deeper. And so, like a terrier, perhaps, I decided to I guess they dig holes too, Randy, so I started to dig. So let's talk about this guy. Now I love reclaiming the philosophical underdogs. And I'll say this in the kindest way possible. This is not Stephen Pepper. Okay, someone whose archives are over here at Dewey, at the Morris Library. I mean, there are all kinds of unsung philosophical heroes out there that write tons of books, and they're important in the academic world, and they ought to be reclaimed. And Ambedkar is of a different magnitude than these folks. You see, in many ways, an imperfect way to describe him is combine someone who's a giver of laws, maybe Moses, maybe Jefferson, someone who's a religious figure, maybe like Jesus, and someone who's a civil rights icon, like Martin Luther King Jr. If you can imagine, or even Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves and putting American blood on the line to do so, imagine combining all of those. That'd be an interesting figure, wouldn't it? And, so in many ways, Ambedkar represents that kind, if not exactly that kind of figure. He's a religious leader to many. There are millions of people in India today that are born and that live and that die in rooms with two pictures on the wall, Buddha and Bhimrao Ambedkar. So he's this fascinating figure. You see here a picture from Lucknow where he's seated, in a monument designed in like the 90s or 2000s. It's a contemporary monument, but it draws upon Abraham Lincoln and the iconography of Abraham Lincoln as an emancipator of the downtrodden. So let's talk about, Bhimrao Ambedkar for about 30 or 40 minutes. Let's talk about him in reference to pragmatism and John Dewey. And let's talk about him as kind of the center point of a story of pragmatism in India. Now, if you don't know about Ambedkar, here's a quick, rundown of his narrative arc. A phenomenal life, a rags to riches type life, a bootstrap type life with your own initiative. He brings himself up. So start at the beginning, 1891. His birthday is usually, listed in April, but he was an untouchable. These are folks that are consigned below the lowest official caste groups that are religiously sanctioned. So he is in a group that's religiously polluting by touch, presence, shadow, etc. So his birth date is not recorded. There aren't records of this, and you'll find his later records. He'll put different birth dates. So think about him as being in the most oppressed strata of the Indian society of his time. His technical caste designation is a Mahar, but this is one of the many groups that are in the untouchable kind of category. Now through his own efforts, through the efforts of people like his father, who was educated and supported and trained by the British. His father served in the British Army. He started to value education. People like his father pushed him to go into school, to keep with school, etc. And he lucked out. Some local leaders, Prince of Baroda, supported some of his endeavors later on. He starts with Elphinstone College there in Bombay. And then eventually that same leader in Baroda, who believed in a form of kind of affirmative action, for installing civil servants from the untouchable castes and also educating untouchables, the same leader paid his way to Columbia University in 1913. Now this is phenomenally unique. Everyone else you can find, Nehru, Gandhi, you pick any Indian leader that was like at the forefront of the independence movement, most likely they were from an upper caste, quote unquote upper caste, and almost certainly they went, if they did schooling, they went to somewhere in the British Empire. Okay, so Ambedkar ended up in the classrooms at Columbia University, and these classes that he took, you'll see some shots of his transcript, they were filled with some of the most progressive, trend-setting academics of his day, folks like Seligman, Simkovich, John Dewey. Okay, he took a couple classes from Montague, but then he quit. So I like to say he voted for pragmatism with his feet over William Pepperell Montague. So at any rate, he has this fascinating arc. Then at Columbia, though, he starts this kind of quest for degrees. He ends up getting about 5 degrees. He spends 3 years at Columbia, gets a master's while there, and then he goes on to a year in London. His money runs out, so he comes back. And eventually he goes back to London around 1921 to finish up those degrees, the London School of Economics, Gray's Inn, he gets his law degree. He eventually does all the work, publishes his PhD thesis for Columbia, and so he gets his Columbia PhD around 1925 or 1926. And so he has this fascinating educational story. And then what does he do with this? He's a PhD, right? But he doesn't go be a scholar like us and write books for people who write books for people who write books. He goes right into activism, especially activism oriented towards getting access to untouchables, access to temples, access to water supplies. You see, this is one of the most pernicious things about untouchability in this kind of Hinduism of his day. They were counted as Hindus in that religious structure, but they weren't allowed into the temples. They couldn't see or get near the idols, the icons of God. So he started in 1926 to push for things like this or for water access. And they were, on the stage behind him was a picture of Gandhi. So he was part of this kind of Gandhian movement. About 1931, he famously breaks with Gandhi because the British give the untouchables some voting concessions. And Gandhi says, I don't want any fracturing of the Hindu bloc. And so Gandhi embarks on a fast until death. And I think this really showed Ambedkar that nonviolence, ahimsa, can be just as forceful as violence. So he ends up giving in to Gandhi, signs this thing called the Pune Pact, but he never forgave Gandhi. And so from then on out, he starts his split from Hinduism. 1935, 1936, he shakes the world of India by announcing in 1935 that even though I was born a Hindu, I will not die a Hindu. And so he starts this kind of quest for a religion that would give him the rights that untouchability within Hinduism denied him. And then from there on out, he leads more social protests. He gets into politics in the 40s. Nehru didn't agree with Ambedkar in many cases, but he had the foresight to see he was one of the leading legal minds of his time. So he taps Ambedkar to be one of the chief, if not the chief, draftsperson of the Indian Constitution, the document in the 40s that creates the world's largest democracy. And then in the 1950s, Ambedkar splits with Nehru, largely over a bill called the Hindu Code Bill, which would have codified divorce rights for females and inheritance rights for females, secularized a lot of stuff that was made religious in the newly independent Indian country. And the country wasn't ready for it right then, and Ambedkar quits his job as law minister when Nehru wouldn't support these bills. And in some ways, that was a fortuitous move, because Ambedkar then had all this time, in the last 5 years of his life, to embark on a social conversion campaign. And I'll talk about this today a bit, but he started turning towards religious conversion, social activism as a means of political amelioration. So again, he didn't want to be, want to die a Hindu. And so he starts at the end of his life overtly saying, convert to Buddhism and reclaim your respect and your dignity. And so in one of the world's ultimate mic drops, about 4 weeks before he dies, he converts in a dusty field in Nagpur in front of 500,000 who convert right after him, supposedly the world's largest voluntary mass conversion. So I'll talk to you about some parts of each of this timeline, but there's a lot more you can go into. Now, why should we even care about this, right? Why should we, I assume everyone in this room is committed to the study of American philosophy, pragmatism perhaps more specifically. Well, you're going to see that Ambedkar is an important part to that story. He's really an important part to a variety of stories. One story that he will fit into quite well is a story we're getting more and more interested in. How American thought is not just American. It goes elsewhere, it gets changed in other countries, it gets adapted in other countries, it gets improved in other countries. Imaginative possibilities that someone like Dewey or James didn't see here might get seen in Italy, might get seen in China. So we know about various internationalization efforts, contemporary efforts in Poland. We know the Chinese story starts in 1919 with Hu Shi. And we've seen how pragmatism its star has waxed and waned in China, and now it's they're more popular than ever, I believe. But there's still one huge blank spot on that kind of intellectual map. That is the story of pragmatism in the world's largest democracy, India. Now, as you will see, Ambedkar is the centerpiece for that. Hu Shi sat right next to him, or in the same room, in 1915, 1916. They were in the same Dewey class. I've been able to prove this. So Dewey kind of plants these seeds, and other people go elsewhere and do things with parts of Dewey's philosophy and improve on Dewey's philosophy in many ways. Other stories that this fits into are a little less historical and more conceptual. We wonder, what do we mean by democracy? Pragmatism is often taken as having a unique stance on it. Democracy as a way of life, deep democracy, or social democracy. Ambedkar will have something new and unique to say about that given the turbulent situation in India. And what I love about it is India is much like the US back then and now. It's a pluralistic society, that has a lot of people saying critical and harsh things about each other. So there's a certain amount of freedom and chaos that goes with that freedom. And there's a certain quest for unity and shared interest that's there in India as well as America, even today. So I think there's something that can be said about the nature of democracy and its challenges. There's also a sense of what social justice looks like. Caste is the operative category for Ambedkar, whereas race and sexism and other sorts of oppression might be our operative categories. But if really an injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere, caste, a system that Dalit scholars say oppresses over 300 million people across the globe, ought to be part of our stories of social justice. And then lastly, there's a sense where a lot of times we see Dewey, from the 30s on, as giving kind of a watered down view of religion. I have religion and humanity or something like this. This is what we got. But Ambedkar, in a unique fashion, pushes Buddhism to the forefront of religion, its texts, its rituals. And so, I want to make the argument, oftentimes people say, Ambedkar wasn't a pragmatist, he was a Buddhist. I like to say his Buddhism was how he enunciated his pragmatism. So religion was a key ameliorative strategy for him, and it's something that we don't often see when we look at the political forms of pragmatism in our go-to figures. Now let's go to where this starts. Columbia University. This is where Dewey was teaching, and he was arguably one of the leading philosophical lights in the 1910s across the nation. He was very famous and very busy, and somehow a young Indian stumbled into his classroom and took it. Now, I've seen the orders Ambedkar signed with the Gaikwad of Baroda, the Prince of Baroda. They say he's only supposed to take classes in politics and economics, his major. Okay, so he technically shouldn't have been in Dewey's class. Why was he in those classes? I've never found a concrete answer. I think it was Dewey had such a stature, this person had to see what he was offering. And Ambedkar fell in love with it, as you will see. So, Columbia at the beginning is going to be so essential. Columbia at the end of his life. Ambedkar wrote the Constitution for the world's largest democracy. The Constitution is formed, that world's largest democracy. And so Columbia recognizes this. They call him back in 1952 to receive an honorary doctorate. And when Ambedkar's bouncing around his plane on the way there, Dewey made the unfortunate mistake of previously wrestling with his grandkids, breaking a hip and getting pneumonia and dying. Lesson, if you're going to be famous, do not wrestle with kids when you're that old. So Ambedkar lands, and he obviously was excited to see his teacher, who I found no evidence that he's ever corresponded or attempted to correspond with since 1916, when he last was in the presence of Dewey in the classroom. So he was obviously excited to see Dewey, but here he arrives and Dewey's dead. And so he writes a famous letter that every biographer of Ambedkar points to, but no one goes any deeper than this. That supposedly Ambedkar said, I owe my entire intellectual life to Dewey. But what does he mean by that? So this is what my project's trying to flesh out. What can we say beyond just platitudes about Dewey mattered to him, or they both loved democracy? So in other words, there's a historical story here about influence, about reception, about acceptance of certain ideas and resistance of certain ideas. That's one interesting thing I've learned as I've gotten into this historical type work. Influence doesn't always mean you just repeat something. You can appropriate it, you can change it, you can resist it and do something differently with a conscious idea of what you're resisting. So there's this historical story I'll talk about a bit today. And then there's this more conceptual story of when we think about the distinctive parameters of, let's say, Husserl's instrumentalism or pragmatism, there's something new that's added to our pantheon of possibilities of pragmatism. And the same thing has to be what we do when we think about Ambedkar's pragmatism. It's no copy of Dewey or anyone else. It's something worth adding to our stories and our classes. Now, this project has been one of the most fun and most challenging ones of my life. I'm not a historian by training. I like to just think and argue and be argumentative like philosophers do. But I've started to realize over the last 10 years that to get behind the text, to see what someone's thinking, what choices they're making, what sources they're drawing on, requires you to look at things in archives. And everything in India is different than archives here, where you have finding aids. So it's been a frustrating, a rewarding, and exciting process to try to get into every notebook or mark that Ambedkar has made. And along the way, I've made sure and talked to and listened to every Dalit activist, scholar, politician, lay people. One of my best friends here, Mr. Vijay Sarwade, is a retired banker who is now the leading collector of pictures of Ambedkar. So there's all these people that are fleshing out their part of this story, and if I can contribute anything, it might be to dig a little bit into the Dewey story. Now, if you want the boring details, you can check the book here in America out, the Chicago edition, which has rhetoric in the title, because you'll see there's a rhetorical angle to what I'm talking about. The South Asian Trade edition from HarperCollins has a different title, but it's all the same except for 5 words. Ask me about that story later off the record. It had something to do with free speech laws. But at any rate, it's been phenomenal to have people on 2 different continents either talking about Ambedkar more than they might, or people in India in their, like the Hindu or the Hindustani Times, in the mainstream newspapers wrestling with pragmatism. You don't see Dewey's name mentioned in newspapers here that often. And so it's exciting because we're at the cusp of, I think, more people talking about pragmatism, good or bad, in India. Now, there's always been a story here, though, right? There's always been a story, but you just need the motivation to dig. And too many people were content to say, Dewey was one of many influences Ambedkar had, and then they move on. But see, I didn't do that. And so one place I love to visit is a college he started in 1946, Siddharth College in Mumbai. They have about 5,000 of his books that he owned. And some of these books, you can tell the provenance of them because he signed them. So for instance, here we have one of the 20-some books of Dewey's that's signed and dated 1914. This is right in the fall when he took his first Dewey class. More on that in a second. Now, I didn't notice it the first time I thumbed through this book looking at the annotations, but I noticed it the second time I visited this location. And what I saw was phenomenal. In the back, there was a crumpled piece, a folded piece of scrap paper torn in half. And you see like he's blotting his ink pen on it. He loved ink pens. But what else do you see there? You see him wrestling with a philosophical term. Anyone who reads Kant inevitably scratches their head at, manifold. On page 211 of this book, that term appears. And he starts doodling out his signature, which radically changes, and he starts doodling John Dewey's signature. So right from his first encounter with Dewey in fall of 1914, he starts this intellectual relationship with the sage of pragmatism. Now, I found more evidence that I think is just incredibly important. Again, if you're open to digging deeper on the Dewey story. So one thing I realized was Dewey's famous. Famous people have other folks that write down the recollections of him. So I started scouring all of the students, former students of Dewey, that had nothing to do with India, but that could get me into the classroom. Spoiler alert, Dewey was an incredibly boring teacher. Okay, they all agree on this. That's one thing the lawyers made me take out of the HarperCollins edition because it might be slanderous to Dewey. I said, well, I don't think, but okay, whatever. So at any rate, so one of the best, longest, most detailed recollections I found was held here at the Dewey Center, at SIU Carbondale, is by a philosopher named Nima Adler-Blum, who spent a long time at Columbia, 1905 to 1926, when she eventually publishes her dissertation on a Jewish philosopher. She was a student of Dewey's, but she stalked him in all his classes. Even when she wasn't enrolled, she would sit in on his classes. And, so this was awesome. So her recollection covered a bunch of stuff. And she starts talking about all the students from China and Japan that sat in on Dewey's classes. This was interesting. And then she came to a paragraph that stopped my heart for a second. And here it is. She said, there was also a student from India I saw daily. Now, she never names this student. This is just a paragraph. I give you the whole paragraph. I've trimmed it down here a bit, but in the book I give the whole paragraph. But she never names the student, whom I saw daily, always with a pen and a paper. He was reading Dewey's articles, and we would ponder together the many ideas. He recopied the class notes after each lecture. Whenever he read some of them, it felt as if I heard Dewey himself talking, not a single word omitted. He also showed me his attached comments, searching for a bridge between Dewey and Buddhism. Both, he said, aim at the highest morality, but Dewey's drive for a good society might be more conducive to happiness than nirvana. In the United States, he met Dewey, who gave a new turn to his life. In infusing Dewey's concept of an idealistic democracy, he may be of some help in easing the ugly ingrained tradition of the untouchables. Now, like I said in my book, I dissect this passage, but this has to be Ambedkar. No other Indian, first of all, Dewey didn't have any Indian students that were following him like this, formally or informally, at Columbia in the 1910s that I could find, or folks like Larry Hickman or Tom Alexander could identify. Also, every Indian student you found was interested in independence, Swaraj, self-rule. So Ambedkar is unique in the pantheon of political figures in India as focusing on untouchable rights and social reform first, not political reform, freedom from the British. So this is just fascinating. And Buddhism, so this letter just is shocking because the traditional story, right, is in 1935, he says, I'm going to get out of Hinduism. And then in 1949 or 1950, he starts publicly saying, I'm going to convert and my fellow untouchables should convert to Buddhism. So, the traditional story you get is he shops around for 20 years and then really makes his decision around 1949. If this recollection is accurate and is pointing towards, Ambedkar, when he was at Columbia, he was invested in Buddhism and he was invested in a synergy with Dewey, not a replacement with Dewey. So this is just a fascinating new story that's waiting to be told. Now, what does it mean to be a pragmatist? I shouldn't have to say this for this crowd, but oftentimes folks think, and I'll talk more about this in my talk at the Dewey conference on Friday, but oftentimes the idea is being a pragmatist means one set of doctrines at the exclusion of other doctrines. But as anyone who studies pragmatism knows, it's a very loose term, a descriptor. It describes a historical trajectory you're in, people you're agreeing with, reading, disagreeing with, arguing with. It also could describe conceptual similarities. And this is why in 1938, Ambedkar calls the Buddhist the first pragmatist in an article where he's maligning Gandhi. So, what it doesn't mean, though, is that Ambedkar is simply repeating what Dewey was saying. Now, where did he start with Dewey? This was always something that no one gave me many details on, but people have his transcript publicly available, and Columbia has its course bulletins from the era, so you can put these two together and you can find out who was teaching what classes and what classes he took. And like I said, he took 5 philosophy classes, 2 from Montague, which he dropped, and then, according to his transcript, and 2 from Dewey he sat in on, which was kind of the norm in those days unless you were really into a major. So the classes, he took 3 from Dewey. One was the first year of first course of a 2-course segment, which was Dewey's Psychological Ethics. That's Philosophy 231. The other course in 1915 to 1916 is the one Husserl also sat in on, and that was the moral and political philosophy class that Dewey taught. And in Ambedkar, it's listed as both of those that he took. There's no evidence that he took Dewey's education classes. He also kept up, after he left in 1916, he kept up with Dewey's thought, not by writing Dewey, but by collecting his books. Ambedkar, when he died, had about 50,000 books between his 2 houses in Mumbai and New Delhi. And a lot of these books got donated to his colleges that he started. I'm still in the general stacks that students check out, finding his books that he underlined, and I have to give it to the archivist. But that's another story. But I've looked at every book that he has owned and marked, and I can tell you with absolute certainty there's no contemporary author, including Marx or whoever, including Gandhi, there's no contemporary author that he owned more books of than John Dewey. About 22 books, multiple copies of some. Democracy in Education, he had 4 copies, 2 heavily annotated. So, he kept on, and notice they're from the 50s as well. So, they're not just from his school days. So he kept touch with Dewey from a distance this way. Now, let me talk a bit about what I call his pragmatism. Now, his Buddhism is always called Navayana Buddhism to differentiate it from Theravada, the older strands of Buddhism, Mahayana, the big vehicle Buddhism. And Ambedkar, supposedly at a press conference, said his Buddhism is a Navayana one. And so that term is stuck among those following in his wake because it differentiates his form of Buddhism from other forms. And we'll see some of the parameters of that as I go forward. But his pragmatism, I think, could be described similarly. His pragmatism is a new sort of pragmatism, so I like to call it Navayana pragmatism. And there's 3 commitments to this that I think you can kind of get a handle on. 1, the idea that caste is a habit. 2, that force is both necessary and worrisome. And 3, that religion is a key means of amelioration. Now let's talk about each of these and how they relate to Dewey. So that Philosophy 231 class, this is another, I think, scandal in the study of Ambedkar. Everyone knows that his education mattered to him, but no one knows the content of that education. They know what classes he took, maybe at Columbia, maybe at London School of Economics. He took classes supposedly from Lasky, but no one knows the details of what went on there. If it was today, we'd look at his TikTok or his Twitter and say he didn't like that lecture or whatnot. But we don't have that granular detail in the 1910s. So, what's the closest thing we can get? Syllabi and notes. And I think it's just something that the scholars of Ambedkar need to do to push further and find out what these folks were teaching, because the assumption is what Shotwell, for instance, James Shotwell at Columbia was teaching must have been what he was writing in his book. But some people think that what Ambedkar heard from Dewey was what he was writing in Democracy and Education. That's absolutely false. So if you look at what the course content is, you can get a good handle on what he's hearing. And so thanks to the Dewey Center here, I was able to unearth a variety of documents that give me that detail of a daily record of what Ambedkar was hearing in Dewey's classes. No other course of his or even his advisor, no one has that kind of detail on what he was exposed to from these people. So in Philosophy 231, we know for a fact the story he gets. Dewey's kind of evolving naturalism, the idea that humans are creatures that are psychologically and socially formed and informed, the idea that we have habits that can be more intelligent or less intelligent, and the idea that attitudes are a form of habit and how we anticipate our reactions with others. And you start looking at some of the notes from students that were in that class, and you start to see that Dewey's giving them a certain story on the impulses as not being moral or immoral, but as things that need to be made more intelligent. And you see that the idea of attitudes as habits are important because they project certain pathways and reaction strategies. Certain things are repulsive, certain things are attracting us, you see. So when you look in the 1930s and you scratch your head at why Ambedkar in 1936, Annihilation of Caste, this is the most famous work he ever did. It was so powerful, they canceled a conference that he was supposed to deliver it at because they didn't want him to deliver it. That's hardcore. So, so he publishes it as a book. But it's one of his most lasting works. But in that work, he's maligning the system of oppression with hierarchies and castes that look down on each other and look upwards at the people that oppress them in turn or have different statuses and values over them in turn. And he says, what's the core to that? He says caste is a state of mind. It's a notion. It's not a physical thing, and breaking it down will not be a physical change. It will be a change in the ideas and attitudes people have. And so when you combine that with the Deweyan psychology he's hearing in 1914, it starts to click. At least for me, it does. The idea, the key thing, and today we may not think like this, right? Too often today we say racism is systemic, and we start looking up at big things, ideologies, systems, things that are intangible to some extent. And Ambedkar in some ways is jarringly fresh as a voice to add to that conversation because he instantiates this stuff in the attitudes and habits of people to some extent. Habits are really just individual customs. Customs are group aggregate habits. And so what he starts to say is that the caste labels are these kind of outflowings of these attitudes that segregate people and keep their values differentiated in a hierarchy of caste. And so you start to see how some of the things that he heard in Dewey he takes to a context that Dewey didn't know much about. The second theme, force and social democracy. Now go to that class that he sat in the same room as Husserl. Husserl was also incredibly influenced by Dewey's reading of Force, although Husserl kind of went in a pacifist direction with it. But if you know about Dewey, in that class, Dewey was kind of a cheerleader for U.S. involvement in the Great War, the war to end all wars. And so you get a certain version of his moral political philosophy in that course. And this is why I always scratch my head at people that think Dewey means one thing, and they say Ambedkar surely is not that philosophy. Well, in that one course that Ambedkar took, I found 3 sets of notes that have been published from 1898 to 1902. But Dewey adds topics, subtracts topics. So that course became a different course right before the Great War because Dewey was interested in why the U.S. should ever engage in a violent course of action. And so in that course, Dewey makes a distinction in 1916 in that course between force as energy, which is necessary for achieving ends, and force as violence, which is destructive. He also utters one line where he has the French Revolution's motto, liberty, equality, fraternity. Now you may ask, how do I know Ambedkar heard this stuff? Well, the fascinating thing is that class, I've never been able to find Dewey's lecture notes, like what he prepared and crumpled up. But I did find 2 sets of student notes by Hale and Dubs, respectively, that give you a granular detail of every day. And some of the days, they were sick, and who's the substitute note taker? Ambedkar. So we know with a fact he heard those 3 terms in March of 1916. He may have read them earlier, but show me some evidence. So these terms, though, if you know your Indian political history in the last 100 years, very important. In the preamble of the Indian Constitution that Ambedkar took a very heavy hand in drafting, you saw those 3 terms, with liberty, equality, fraternity. And then when he starts leaving politics, and warning people about certain trends, in Indian politics in 1949, he says, look, India has a political democracy, but it needs a social democracy. What is a social democracy? And he says, quote, a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. So, he starts drawing on these in ways that Dewey never drew on. And so what you start to see is that in Ambedkar's social philosophy, he portrays justice as a balance among equality, freedom, and fraternity or fellow feeling, or what he calls later Maitri in the Buddhist lexicon. And you see these as semi-transcendent ideals. This is something that fascinates me, right? Usually Dewey, and he says this in his class in so many words, our moral ideals come from our tradition or our context we're in, our historical setting, right? Dewey is no Kant with pure reason and the categorical imperative. But the problem with that for young Ambedkar was the context he was in was 2,000 plus years of certain interpretations of Hindu texts that justified caste hierarchies and untouchability. So he could not find the kinds of values to criticize and reform that tradition within the tradition. So on the other hand, he didn't want to, he read Kant. I found his books of Kant where he underlines it. He couldn't go down that path. So what he sees in those three values are something in a middle ground between something emerging from a historical context, but something that doesn't have the ring of the eternal to it, because that's exactly what people claimed about the Vedic ideas that underlied Hinduism and caste hierarchies, was that they're timeless and they had to be this way. He also has a concern for individuals and groups. And again, too often we think in just terms of aggregates. And so you'll see in a second, he really focused in on the individual aspect. And the Deweyan term of reflective thinking becomes a key part of his social meliorization. Now let's think about theme 2, force and reform. Now, I've learned that sometimes the things that look odd are the most interesting things. And Ambedkar, as far as I can tell, only published one book review over his whole life. And that was when he was a struggling, stockbroker, effectively. He came back from America and London, highly educated, but he couldn't maintain his job at Baroda because people wouldn't hand files to an untouchable. They would throw them at him because they didn't want to have the touch contact happening. And so he quit that job, couldn't find housing in Baroda. So in Mumbai, he starts a string of kind of odd jobs like stockbroker, lawyer, but we constantly had problems with who would hire someone that was an untouchable. So at any rate, during that time, he oddly publishes a book review. Okay, now it's a book review of Bertrand Russell. The story gets odder. It's in an Indian economics journal, and the book has nothing to do with economics or India. Bertrand Russell's book, as Ambedkar admits in the review, is a war book. It's Bertrand Russell, of course, is a famous pacifist, and he's wrestling with the British trying to think they have a justified course of action in the Great War. And so Ambedkar reviews this, and it's just fascinating to see what goes on. Now, look at the book, and you might see what Ambedkar is intrigued by. Russell's stance is basically that force is always worrisome, because you think you're overcoming an oppressor, but then you're probably going to be oppressive in some way you didn't anticipate when you win. And so in Russell's schema, this is the Brits saying we got to beat those Germans, but in reality, the Brits beating the Germans, they're going to be oppressive, or as cutthroat as the Germans would have been if they would have won. And so Russell has this kind of cynical realism to politics, and you surely see what Ambedkar saw in that. What does a reformer want to do? Disempower or destroy those who are oppressing the reformer or someone the reformer cares about. And so if you think one step ahead of that, you see where Ambedkar is. How can I beat the oppressor and not become a new sort of oppressor? And Russell fit that storyline to a T with what he was wrestling with. So in that book, Ambedkar, again to Indian audiences, reading an economics journal, starts talking about, Indians, if they read this book, shouldn't get fixated on Russell as a quietist. Don't think about him as simply, disabling all activity. And then he brings in Dewey for the first time in print. And then he refers again to the idea of force as violence, force as energy. And, he says, look, Russell is for force as energy, but he's against violence. So in some ways, he's explaining what Russell's point is by showing how Dewey has a superior explanatory mechanism, especially for Indian audiences. And so if you look at Dewey's notes from that year that he shared with Husserl, you see Dewey say this distinction that fits that article to a T. Interestingly enough, you also see Dewey say a very cursory reference to nirvana as pacifistic quietivism. So who knows, Ambedkar might have loved Dewey but hated his view of Buddhism, or he might have said Dewey's thought is useful in combining with a better understanding of Buddhism. So the challenge for Ambedkar's pragmatism from 1918 on to the end of his life was, how do I get reform without causing new problems or destroying the sort of deep social democracy denoted by fraternity in addition to equality that I want? Now let's think about the last theme here. Buddhism has to be part to Ambedkar's story. This is going to be what my next book is about, because when I got to the 1950s, I just couldn't do it justice. But Ambedkar leaves politics largely and starts to reconstruct Buddhism in the way only a pragmatist could, in a way that annoyed a variety of Orthodox Buddhists of his day. and he makes it a form of social gospel. So he was still a pragmatist though, right? He still had his beloved copies of Democracy and Education. Here you see a line where he's underlined it. Now I've never been able to figure out his annotation scheme, but I know this for a fact. He underlined this at probably 4 different times because there are 4 different pencils using, marks. There's a red pencil, a blue pencil, a gray pencil. So he's sitting down at different times reading this passage and still taking the effort to mark it. So you'll see this line appear in about 3 of his speeches and texts, okay, without attribution, but he thinks it's so important he echoes this. So the idea that democracy is more than a form of government, it's a mode of associated living. Now Buddhism becomes his way of envisioning this sort of community of shared interests that he wants in the last part of his life. Another book that he had multiple copies of, I've been able to find 2 copies of the 1908 Ethics, not the 32 Ethics. He had no wind of that, I don't think, but the 1908 with Tufts, the first edition of Ethics. He liked that book. He had 2 copies of it. Both are heavily annotated. They were actually the 1910 British reissue. So you see in both copies, he marks in the margins, I've circled it, the same passage. And here it is zoomed in. It's the classic Deweyan distinction between rules and principles. You know what Dewey's aiming at here, the Old Testament's 10 Commandments or Kant's hard and fast derivations of moral duties. Those are things that Dewey thinks are not helpful for moral philosophy. They fit the lineage of rules. What you want are principles for Dewey's view of ethics in this book. Now Ambedkar sees this, and even though he's not writing a boring book on ethics, he sees something very useful here. So for instance, in that famous Annihilation of Caste essay, where he is castigating a certain interpretation of Hinduism that reads this kind of rigid caste hierarchy all the way down, he evokes, without bringing up Dewey's names, the same exact distinction in the same exact words, rules and principles. And what he says is we need, maybe we can revise Hinduism into a religion of principle, but it surely should not stay as a religion of rules, of hard and fast rules that have the aura of timelessness. So in the 1950s, way towards the end of his life, he starts an overt turn towards Buddhism. And Buddhism becomes the sort of religion of principle he wanted people to find in that 1936 essay. Now it's important in Annihilation of Caste, he doesn't say Buddhism is the religion of principle. He really in the text gives 2 candidates. He says maybe Guru Nanak, Sikhism, and the Upanishads, maybe these can be the basis for creating a religion of principle. By the 50s, he's definitely set like a laser beam on Buddhism. And why did Buddhism die? You see in this kind of passage from an article he wrote in the 50s at the end of his life. He said, he says it's so important he says it twice. I don't know why he needs to repeat it. But Buddhism lacked, abiding principles. Notice it also lacked commanding and conquering orators. If you know anything about Dewey's speech style, Dewey was not a commanding orator. People in China went to hear him even though they couldn't understand what he was saying because he was Mr. Democracy, Mr. Science. Ambedkar, a small conference for Ambedkar was 30,000 of his Dalits, untouchables, listening to him. So Ambedkar was a conquering orator. Now, unlike Dewey, though, think about 1915, 1916. The story Dewey sells to Hu and Ambedkar is the idea that the individual is formed by the society and the society is informed by individuals. There's no opposition between these two. It's more of like a productive dialectic. Ambedkar saw in that hyphen a point for leverage. So this really dawned on me when I found a 1948 book in the collection of books that he owned, where there are no other marks in the book, and the book is pretty unremarkable. But it's on karma and karma and rebirth. And if you know about untouchability, right, that's the justification for it. You are born into this caste because of what you did in the past life. And if you play your part right, maybe in the next birth, you'll get a better birth. So karma is an incredibly oppressive doctrine if you interpret it that way. Okay, so what do you see on the table of contents page, though? Ambedkar scrawls in his own hand the question he surely was thinking as he flipped through or read this book. What place has will and effort in the law of karma? So he was always attuned to what the individual can do to alter the group. And I don't think Dewey had that same problematic. Dewey was worried about reforming the school system and then producing individuals that could have interests that count. But Ambedkar saw a society that he was brazen enough to be able to press on a lever and that group would jump a little bit or move. You also see this in the 1950s. He sets out on the Great task. He was always envious of the Christians because they had an easily portable gospel. Okay? He always said the Buddhists are limited because they had 300 suttas. So what does he do? As a pragmatist, he does what he needs to do. He says, let's rewrite the Buddhist Bible. There's a lot of chutzpah here to this endeavor. So he goes about in 1951 writing a book called The Buddha and His Gospel. It's based upon a book over here outside of the special collections, the Paul Karras Gospel of the Buddha. He loved that book, but it wasn't perfect, so he had to write his own perfect retelling of the Buddhist story. But in that, and then later it's the one that gets published right after he dies, is The Buddha and His Dhamma. Okay, and in that finalized version, next to every page number, there's a mudra, a hand gesture. And I found the 1940s book in his collected works that's icons of Tibetan Buddhism. And there's a section in there of, 7 mudras. 2 of the mudras have his check marks by them, and they're right here. The abhyaya, which is protection or blessing, or tarjani, which is menacing. Which one do you think ends up at every corner of the Buddhist Bible he reconstructs? His Buddhism was an aggressive one, okay? It's not menacing or aggressive in the form of violence, but he didn't want it to be a passive retreat into the self to release yourself from samsara. It was a social gospel in the Deweyan or Jane Addams sense. It was a religion that oriented towards social suffering and its alleviation. So, it was not something that would abide injustice. You also see an interesting feature here. He writes Marx into his Buddhist Bible. In the 50s, he was constantly comparing, like Dewey was always doing, his view of socialism or democracy, or social democracy, with the kind of Marxist alternatives that would too often give in to force. So Buddhism becomes his idiom of democracy. Now think about October 14th, 1956, the date of his conversion. Dusty Field in Nagpur, he gets administered 22 vows to become a Buddhist. He designs these vows. They're not in the Buddhist tradition. His wife takes these vows, and then all the people in the audience are invited to take these vows. Now, if you start to look at these vows with this kind of Deweyan lens, you start to see how some are rules telling you not to do certain things, eat meat or consume alcohol. But some of these are much more flexible, prone to interpretation principles. The things that Dewey thought would be the core of morality and what Ambedkar thinks are the core to a socially engaged religion that could form community. So you see, I shall believe in the equality of mankind. I shall endeavor to establish equality. These are principles that are tough to operationalize, but they get you to engage in ever-changing present. And if there's any 2 philosophies that believe the world is impermanent, it's Buddhism and it's Dewey's pragmatism. So what you see here is he's starting to work out ways that we can instill habits of reflective thinking, intelligent action, and reform our attitudes towards ourselves and our fellow humans. So if you look, and I'll end on this point, you look again at that wonderful text that he revised, he drafted, he published 50 copies in 1951. Someday I want to get that published for the world. And then he gets it published right after he dies. He leaves it with his printer, so he's lucky. The Buddha and His Dhamma. You see a fascinating story there. I don't have time, but part of that story is in 1954, he pesters a student in London to send him a book of Dewey's on democracy. It's at the British Library. It'll only take you a day to copy. And this poor student goes and copies some book under those vague instructions, sends it to him. He said, "This isn't what I wanted." And then the student goes back, eventually sends him what he wanted, the 1888 Ethics of Democracy piece by Dewey. And, I've always speculated, I speculated on print, it was Creative Democracy he got sent. And sure enough, digging through some iron trunks right by an open window where his collected works are jammed, the originals are jammed and are rotting away, what do you find? A hand-typed version of Creative Democracy. So I think Creative Democracy changed the story here. Way of Life appears 0 times in this. Way of Life appears 22 times in that. Way of Life, of course, appears a lot in Creative Democracy. So look at those texts. In the second edition, the final edition, he talks about ahimsa in certain ways. And this really annoyed the Buddhists. In 1959, in the leading Buddhist journal, you get this pseudo-anonymous review published that says Ambedkar is positively dangerous. And he's mealy-mouthed, and the whole reads as inciting acts of violence. These are Buddhists talking about his Buddhist Bible. So it's a fascinating kind of case of reaction discussion and criticism among Buddhists in the kind of modernist tradition. But if you look at what they were annoyed at, it's his reading of Ahimsa. This is a new section that appears in the second version of this, not in the 51 edition. So what do you see in here? Well, you see Ambedkar wrestling with the idea, is Ahimsa? Is this idea of nonviolence absolute, or is it relative? And then you start hearing words you should recognize from the 1908 ethics. Is it a principle or is it a rule? And so he translates it in his retelling of the Buddhist story to one of not nonviolence, but of love. You know, the Buddha meant ahimsa as love all, so that you don't have to kill anyone. And so this is a principle of ahimsa. And then you see, as if you didn't get it already, he ends that section by saying the Buddha made a difference between a principle and a rule, or a principle and a way of life. And then he says something in words better than Dewey could ever say it. He says, a rule either breaks you or you break the rule. They're just too hard and fast and too certain for an ever-changing world, especially one where we're trying to form democracy. In the 50s, you see unpublished pieces like his well-known essay on Buddha or Karl Marx. But once again, he draws back not to Dewey of Trotsky, in this debate with Marxism, but he goes right back to that 1916 class where Dewey talked about forces, energy, force, and violence. And he criticizes Marxism as trying to achieve things like equality at the cost of fraternity. So you can't get one of these three values, equality, liberty, or fraternity, at the cost of the other one or two. So you need to find this unstable balance. And that is tough. And Ambedkar at the end of his life says Buddhism is helpful because of the principles like ahimsa as love. So in closing, what you start to see here is a fascinating new version of Buddhism you might not have heard about if you pay attention to Ambedkar. But from the pragmatist point of view, it becomes a religion of principle. And you start to see how things like love, things like communication and rhetoric, which I haven't talked about much today, become important parts of this story as a kind of acceptable, intelligent sort of force versus oppressive force. So in conclusion, right, Ambedkar's story is complex. There are many stories to tell about him, but there's one story that should interest us. It's a story of how his thought shows an evolution of pragmatism in India. It's a story that brings caste into focus when it comes to social justice, but it also goes beyond just that battle of his time to something we can consider more of a timeless philosophy of how do we achieve the fraternity or fellow feeling democracy compels us to in situations of injustice, of inequality. So how do you get a good state of affairs without creating something even worse? Now, this is still an unfinished story. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but I'm excited to see more folks in the US talking about Indian thinkers like Ambedkar, and I'm excited to see folks in India talking about American thinkers like John Dewey. Thank you for your attention.
John, I'm going to let you take your own
Sure,
questions,
yeah.
of course, but I have the first one.
Yeah, you have the house, so go ahead.
So, I do not remember what year it was that Gandhi first published his distinction between ahimsa as soul force as opposed to a privative passivity, 1928, 1930, somewhere in that. Is there any chance that his use of the word force in soul force as the interpretation of ahimsa is influenced by Ambedkar? And is there any chance?
Oh, yeah, there's probably some chance. I mean, one thing that I love about, I really hate and love about thinkers like Dewey and Ambedkar is, Dewey wrote 8 million words, and Ambedkar has like 5 million in English. So, incredibly complex. He writes pieces in Marathi about Gandhi where he engages Gandhi, but he's constantly saying Gandhi's view of ahimsa is not useful, and it's not really nonviolent. It's not forceful. But the things that really, where he talks about ahimsa and force, he always talks in that parlance that you saw in the 1918 review. And you look closely, and again, all the stuff I'm pointing you to is all in English. So Ambedkar, most of his publications were in English. So there's no translation issue here. And when you look at the words he uses in that Bertrand Russell essay, it's non-resistance. And Gandhi was using passive resistance until after that time. So satyagraha became his new term, like 1919 onwards. But, in 1918, Ambedkar is wrestling with Russell, but you look at who he's wrestling with in Dewey, and it's Tolstoy. Tolstoy lies behind Russell, lies behind Gandhi in many ways. And so Dewey's target in the lectures were about Tolstoy's view of non-resistance and how it's not useful, force creates more criminals, and, as Dewey reads, a deontological objection in Tolstoy, it's recourse, Dewey says, to the kingdom of darkness, just to use force against humans that deserve respect. And so I think Ambedkar saw that debate. Now, I'm going to write this up at some point, but in 1936, Ambedkar gets 2 volumes of Tolstoy's work. They're signed and dated. In 1949, when he's wooing his second wife, Savita, he tells her to read Tolstoy's biography, and this causes a fight in their letters because Tolstoy did not have a good relationship with his wife. So Ambedkar's wife says, "What message are you trying to send me?" So 2 lessons of that. 1, Tolstoy lies under a lot of the stuff he's wrestling with, and 2, he had no game when it came to romantic love. But so Tolstoy is this figure I never thought that would be so important, but it is for Dewey. He is for Dewey, and he is for Ambedkar. And Gandhi comes into that as a political figure, but it's still the idea of his force just tainted, and surely Gandhi, when Gandhi says, "I'm gonna kill myself," that was a sort of force that Ambedkar hated.
Okay. So soul force in Gandhi's sense, in ahimsa, as he gives that interpretation, he's distinguishing passivity from nonviolent resistance in those pieces that I'm remembering. I think it's the late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that Ambedkar, so what Gandhi's saying does not follow Dewey's 2 kinds of distinction of force. That Ambedkar at least is not recognizing in Gandhi a Deweyan distinction in force.
No, and matter of fact, I've had a friend who speaks Marathi translate some of, because Ambedkar ran like 4 newspapers, and many of them went out of business. But in those newspapers, you'd find him writing these editorials, and he wrote some very extended ones about Gandhi. And there he makes a distinction in the Marathi that gets, best translation is rule versus principle. So he's using the same kind of hammer on Gandhi's kind of, you have to use soul force, not real force. And Ambedkar is just saying that is unrealistic. Ambedkar, for instance, was for Indian resistance to the Germans. He was in favor of armed resistance. Should Japan or Germany make it to India, Gandhi was ready to sit down and let people beat on it. The resistors, and so Ambedkar in many ways is the opposite of Gandhi on so many issues. Gandhi believed in small villages, and Ambedkar said that's where the worst of the oppression continues to live. You need technology and bigger cities, and so it's just a fascinating new story.
Thank you.
Yeah, Danica.
So this has me wondering, was Ambedkar's Buddhist philosophy a kind of socially engaged Buddhism? And if so, how did it differentiate from other forms of socially engaged Buddhism?
Yeah. And there's a whole slew of people that write on socially engaged Buddhism, but what's fascinating is he focuses less on the goals of meditation and nirvana as an individual. Nirvana appears in that English language, Buddha and his Dhamma, but it's not the focus. And like the Four Noble Truths are largely absent from it. There are shades of each of them in there, but in one of the prefaces he wrote for him, he said the Buddhist origin story was a myth. Who doesn't see a dead body or a dead person until they're 29? And so Ambedkar is ready to throw away stuff many Buddhists would say are central to the Buddhist story. So he's, dukkha, for instance, suffering. He defines that as poverty, right? Poverty. Because what he's thinking here is Buddhism, if it's going to be an answer in Asia or the globe to Marx, it's got to deal with that kind of suffering, not desire. So desire plays a role in that story, but he foregrounds other things, socially engaged matters like poverty and class. So it's a fascinating, different form of Buddhism that I've always taught and read.
Thank you.
Yeah, Larry.
Last week I gave a talk to the John Dewey Society of Japan, but via Zoom, and I plugged your book, you'll be happy to know.
Right.
But I believe that you used the word coercive force in that book.
Yeah.
And I was trying to explain to them what that meant.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure I got it right, so why don't you tell me what that means?
Yeah. And then, so like when Dewey So in 1916, right, Dewey has 3 spots where he talks about forces energy, forces violence. He has 2 articles in Journal of Ethics or whatever, and then he has the lecture that we have the transcripts for, thanks to Hale and Dubs. And so what there in some of those other ones, he puts a middle ground of intelligent coercion. And even in the lecture, he talks about this, like what you want is you want shame. So custom, he says, is like a rubber band. It's not like a hard force, but there's some kind of movement and energy in it. And so the examples Dewey gives are odd, but they're good for the day. Drinking and dueling. He said you don't need laws against drinking and dueling because social custom takes the place of those. People that, I guess, challenge people to a duel will get laughed at or have social ridicule. Now, Ambedkar couldn't have liked that explanation because shame has a force which seems to go too far. Because part of being an untouchable is having this lack of self-respect. You bought into the idea that your touch polluted. So for instance, in 26, when he drinks out of that tank in Mahad, the Orthodox folks in the neighborhood had to purify it by dumping like 26 pots of cow urine in it. Okay, so so cow dung and cow urine was more holy and ritually pure than Ambedkar's touch, and so he was fighting against that kind of stuff and the internalization of it. So you need force to get stuff done, but you need to have it attuned intelligently. So I think that's what I meant by coercion is coercion that stops short of individual autonomy truncating physical force. So I think I would oftentimes call it in my book persuasive force was something that came to the forefront in Ambedkar. And that's why he gave over 500 speeches in his life. He was committed to the idea that if he says the right words or writes the right words, things can change. And that's different from someone saying if we can get the right armaments, create our own army, things can change. Or if we get a law that throws people in jail, things can change. What do you think?
Let me follow up
Sure.
on that. Dewey was highly criticized for his position on the Great War.
Yeah.
However, I've always had the feeling that because there was a stalemate and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people were dying on the battlefield every day, that there was a possibility that Dewey was thinking about coercive force as a stalemate breaker, and therefore that his position on intervention in World War I, in the Great War, which, by the way, caused a break with him and Jane Addams and Randolph Bourne, was actually an example and a justifiable move on his part, contrary to most of his critics. What do you think about that?
And I mean, but even before that, like it's fascinating to read Bertrand Russell on this. I mean, Russell and other folks in that vein, they were, Russell was writing articles for like The Atlantic where he's like, we should let Hitler take over, and if he can't really conquer us, but if he does in Britain, he'll have just rubble for the towns. And so he had this view that just invite the conquerors in, don't cooperate with them, and they'll leave. And for someone like Dewey, that's incredibly impractical. And so I think this is what's lying behind Dewey's forces energy, forces violence. What happens with forces violence? He doesn't mean only physical violence. What he means by that is he says the fanatical focus in these lectures. He says the fanatical focus or fixation on one end at the cost of other ends. And Ambedkar surely saw the wisdom in that, right? I mean, what did the Marxists do? We need financial equality, so we got to disempower these people or kill these people. In the 50s, Ambedkar puts it very bluntly. He says the Marxists have the strategy. Now he's probably, maybe he's wrong on this, whatever. This is his interpretation of communism and Marxism. The Marxists have the strategy of killing those who oppose them, and it works because they're not around to oppose them anymore. So think about that as like an example, even if it's unrealistic or only partially realistic, of the idea that there's a certain use of force that costs a lot more because it elevates one end over opposing people's ends. In other words, what I think he's getting at is there's uses of force that could create fraternity or those that accomplish ends by destroying fraternity. I think Ambedkar wants to work on that second route. So
Can I have one
yeah,
more?
of course.
For the last 20 years, I've been working with a different group of Buddhists
Yeah.
who hold the Lotus Sutra in very high regard. And by the way, they have a very similar notion of karma,
Yeah.
which has to do with not what happened, but what you're going to do with your life. And it's in engaged Buddhism, highly oriented toward education. They've founded 2 universities and numerous K through 12s. So I guess the question I want is to have answered is, did Ambedkar ever say anything about the Lotus Sutra?
You know, he may have. There are some folks that have made it their task, and I'm going to engage this literature, where Ambedkar's Buddhist Bible collates a bunch of different source texts. You know, he doesn't have any notes in it, right? You know, his two models were Coercive's Gospel of the Buddha and Narasu's Essence of Buddhism, which quotes James and echoes Peirce, by the way. And so, you know, those are his 2 models, he said, for this book. But both of them read like scholarly things. They don't read like religious texts. So he wanted something that had verse and chapter numbers, and like a Bible, in other words. So he leaves out the source material. So the first reaction was, he's making this up. The secondary reaction in the 60s or 70s, people started digging in to where he's getting this from. You know, and surely the Lotus Sutra is among that. You know, one of them, though, was in A Life of the Buddha, you know, a version kind of told by Kosambi, who was a Buddhist monk. He was a Brahmin, but he converted to Buddhism, influenced by the West and Marx in his own way. But Kosambi's retelling of the Buddha's origin story was that the Buddha was on the losing side of a parliamentary debate about whether to go to war with the Sakya clan, Buddhist clan, to go to war with the neighboring clan over water disputes in a river. You know, and so what's the story in this Buddhist Bible that he foregrounds? It's the Buddha lost a parliamentary vote. The other side, you know, wants to punish Buddha and his side. And Buddha says, I don't want my family to be socially boycotted, you know, not able to get water or food. This is what happens to untouchables, by the way. And so the Buddha goes into renunciation, ascetic life, to, you know, avoid this kind of conflict. And so it's fascinating. He tells the story of the Buddha as a democratic parliamentarian. He tells the story of Buddha as someone worried about the penalties that untouchables worry about. Mm-hmm. So he kind of picks from the tradition, you know, that kind of, you know, the parts that really foreground this. I'm sure the Lotus Sutra is in there somewhere. Every major sutra is in there, but yeah. So that's just, some of this stuff is just fascinating because of the use he puts it too.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering, do we know if Ambedkar thought of converting to other religions like Islam or Christianity? And if he did not, then is it because he thought of these religions as not being born in India as religions of that land, and it might create some sort of hindrance in pursuing his politics because then he would be subjected to othering? So could that be, and he was already facing the caste discrimination. So that is one. And the other question that I wanted to, and should I ask now?
Of course, yeah.
Coming up from the discussion that you were having, that when he talks about Buddhism, he's also talked about, he calls it Navayana, so it is a new kind of Buddhism. So there are a lot of things which are not in Mahayana or Indiana. So, and he chooses Buddhism over Marxism. Mm-hmm. So couldn't he have, say, thought about talking about communism and transforming that or bringing out something from that, and or has he talked about this at all?
Yeah, definitely communism was a major thought in his mind ever since Columbia, right? So, you know, the way I understand Ambedkar on communism, you know, at least like theoretically, like in practice, and he says this in the 50s, the communists in India, he says, quote, "we're just a bunch of Brahmin boys." You know, so they didn't take caste seriously because they benefited from caste. But I think the bigger problem with that was that communism took its shot, the shots were called from outside of India. So back to your first question, which is, you know, where does your kind of philosophical energy come from? You know, is it from India or is it from outside of India? And so he's wrestling with this. The religion question is fascinating. I've heard in the biographies, he had lunch every month with in the 30s and 40s with a Christian bishop in Mumbai. I've never been able to substantiate this or figure out what church or whatnot, so I go visit it and see what. But I've held his Bible from 1936. Someone gifted it to him, and so he was interested in all these religions, like a pragmatist should be. in 36, that Annihilation of Caste, he mentions Sikhism, he mentions Hinduism reconstructed as a religion of principle, but on the cover of the second edition, he has a quotation from the Buddha. So you've got all these hints. He sends people, like, he sent I think was his son one of them, but he sent some of his trusted aides, to check out the Sikhs, and they end up converting. But by the 50s, I think I've been told by scholars that look into this more, he realized that the Sikhs had a certain sort of caste system. They were worried about if there were millions and millions of untouchables that immediately joined the folds of Sikhism, the people that traditionally had power wouldn't have power. So he was worried about equality in that. And things like Islam had too much of a political implication, and things like Christianity would have an implication because they were from outside. So Buddhism, though, fascinated him because it was Indian, but it wasn't like present in every village. It wasn't. It was a blank slate in some ways. And you get those external Buddhists writing in '59 that hated what he did with it, but you don't have people in India having that same reaction. So it was kind of a blank slate, or pieces to build what he wanted to build out of it. And what I've been trying to tell you all and sell is what you saw in that Adlerblum recollection. That what he was after was a synthesis between this kind of view of democracy that Dewey talks about and Buddhism. So this is what it becomes as Navayana Buddhism. So his pragmatism is really his Buddhism, and vice versa. Yeah, yes.
I'm really interested in this notion of equality, liberty, and fraternity as semi-transcendent.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating as Dewey and Kant are both unsatisfactory, right? In some way, there's an oppression to both of them. So let's find not a middle ground, but something new.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what Ambedkar meant by semi-transcendent in terms of where do they come from and how do we know these?
Yeah. Now, he never talked about their status, right? So he talked about, he used them a lot. Like, does Hinduism promote fraternity? Does it promote, he used them as avenues of critique. But he didn't say where they came from. So that's my interpretation. But what he definitely critiqued Hinduism on was, he said Hinduism claims it's the Sanatan or timeless Dharma teaching or moral guides, but it's not. So, and one of my visuals might even had it. He had a copy of Dewey's Quest for Certainty, and he signed it from his Columbia days. So yeah, he and Dewey were on the same wavelength. So many things in philosophy claim a certain certainty or foundationalism that they can't be warranted in claiming. And so he's targeting these things that are so central to the tradition that he's living amongst. And he uses these things that don't come from something similarly timeless. I think that's the key. He doesn't say, look, pure reason tells you this is using people as mere means in violation of formula of humanity as an end in itself, or something Kantian. So that's why I think he's trying to carve out this middle ground. What do you see in Dewey's class that the class Dewey taught Husserl and Ambedkar is just fascinating to read through. Because I expect Dewey. If I paid money to hear Dewey, I don't want to hear Dewey's philosophy. But what Dewey does is he explains Locke. He explains Hume. And in doing that, he has kind of this second level story about individualism and communitarianism and the swings in the Western tradition between these two. But every once in a while, Dewey's perspective breaks through, but it's hard to see. And so you get the idea, and Dewey says as much in there, that these philosophies err when they try to say they're the philosophy for all time. So Dewey takes a couple jabs at Marxism and Hegelianism in his own voice in these lectures. So that's where Dewey's caught. Is he so contextualized that he can't criticize his context except with stuff in the context? And something like liberty, equality, fraternity, if you simply take them as these are useful tensions in life. Let's just apply them to our societies and see if we can make something better. Give up pretense that I have to have some grounding for my standards. Give up some pretense that my standards have to come from within, organically emerge from my life world. If you give up those two pretenses, maybe try these. I'm going to write more on this because I think it's fascinating. These almost might be like three factors in social experience, like Dewey's three independent factors. But where do they come from? These are, in some points, Ambedkar says equality is most fundamental. So everyone writing on Ambedkar, and social justice in general, will immediately focus on that. But the thing that I think is sorely lacking today, and Ambedkar at his other moments said it was the most important thing, was fraternity. You know, because if you can get equality by destroying or politically outvoting or disempowering your enemies, you're not making community with them. You're just making people that are more likely to resist you harder next time. You know, this is what politics in India is about. This is what politics in the U.S. is about. This is what our media environment has got. And so I think, you know, Ambedkar's philosophy is interesting historically, and it's just so relevant for the battles we fight now when we're pursuing this political objective. How do we continue to maintain community while doing this? So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's you know, he's trying to carve out that middle ground. I don't know if he has an answer, but that's an interesting question, right? You know, he's not a philosopher in terms of academic philosophers, so, you know, what's the point of us ruminating on the grounding or justification for something? You know, sadly enough, it's so we can publish a book and get tenure. So Ambedkar didn't have those worries. So, you know, some of these questions we want to ask, he didn't ask. And so, you know, it's fascinating to think of what an intellectual does in these different contexts as an activist. You know, I think that's one reason why we don't teach him in our classes, because we code him only as an activist. You know, we've gotten smart about Adams. She's in our classes as a thinker as well as an actor. We should get smart about people like Ambedkar. You know, he's a thinker and a politician.
We need sublimity as opposed to fraternity. Wouldn't you agree?
I don't, you know, he didn't talk much. You know, like for instance, I don't think he had wind of or had a copy of or read Art as Experience. So he didn't care much about the aesthetics, you know, aesthetic philosophy.
I'm talking about the language, siblinghood rather than brotherhood.
Yeah, well, you know, he'd say fellow feeling. At the end of his life, he says Maitri, the Buddhist conception of love for other humans, you know, or living beings, really. You know, this is a pretty, you know, strong guiding ideal.
I'm just objecting to fraternity.
Yeah, people get hung up on all kinds of things. So think Maitri. But I mean, that's fascinating.
I'm going to go with sublimity.
Sublimity. Well, no one knows what the heck that means.
Sublimity, as in
Sublimity.
sibling.
It's like siblings?
Siblings.
Okay, I see it, yeah.
Yeah. Fraternity.
What about fellow feeling?
I mean, liberty and equality.
Yeah.
Sublimity.
Yeah, question here.
Thank you for telling us this wonderful story of pragmatism go to India. I have a quick question.
Yes.
So, do you think that does this form of pragmatic form of Buddhism want to admit that in this communicative, persuasive force, behind this force, there is a struggle of recognition going on. So in other words, when we talk about the force as energy, does this include some kind of violent elements in this process? So what do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question. And like the whole recognition literature is fascinating to bring into it, because in many ways Ambedkar is worried about how I get respect from other people, which is a form of recognition. Now his formula is intriguing, right? How he sells in the 50s conversion, right? Because he's not just writing boring books like I write or we write perhaps. He's giving speeches to tens, 20, 30,000 people, telling them to convert, like them to convert. So this is always intriguing, is like, why do you go trying to solve a societal social justice issue by telling individuals they need to throw out their Hindu idols, convert, and start thinking of themselves as Buddhists? I think the answer lies within that kind of understanding of how Dewey's psychology navigates material reality and group behavior and individual habit taking. And so I think, as I put it kind of bluntly, is that I think Ambedkar realized that you cannot expect others to respect you if you don't respect yourself. And caste was so pernicious insofar as it made you believe you belonged there in that lowest rung. So, in many ways, recognition from others was predicated upon self-respect. Periyar and others in the Indian context were also pushing this kind of self-respect terminology. So it's a fascinating, different way to engage social injustice than we're used to, which is get people out there, change the laws, get the police, going after the right people, use force in this overt way. And what Ambedkar, I think, realized was there are a lot of uses of force, even if they weren't overtly violent, they were the problematic things. They were problematic insofar as they valued our end over the ends of that person we were targeting, and we couldn't form fellow feeling. We couldn't form community with these people. We were oppositional communities. So this
Gosh,
is
there sure are a lot of sexist habits, aren't there?
yeah, maybe.
Fellow feeling.
Yeah.
Only for men.
Yeah.
Fraternity. only for men.
Yeah, so
and
call
here
it-
you are talking about recognition.
You know what though? But this is a fascinating difference, right? So for instance, when I wrote my book, I had the first version of it. I referred to castes like Ambedkar referred to castes as untouchables, and that's how he referred to all of his English writings. That's how he refers to himself. You know, and so, but it's a very pejorative word, right? So I had this decision, which was tough. Do I maintain a historical accuracy, but also replicate the kind of negativity to this? So I made the call that when I quoted Ambedkar, I would use this term. When I referred to him, I would use the self-chosen term Dalit, which which is still with its problems and controversies. The thing I learned though, Randy, is you'll never be free of any kind of critique.
Well, sure.
You know,
sure.
so yeah, I mean the terminology is imperfect, but I think the question is how do we get a more perfect result from what we're talking and doing? You know, this is the question Ambedkar I think would really emphasize. Yeah, yes, right here, sir, and then we got plenty of time.
We did.
Maybe.
Infinite amount.
Yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
just a little curious. First of all, thank you for this in-depth address on Ambedkar.
Thank you for staying awake.
It was really
Yeah, I'm excited
informative.
about this, so I talked too long.
But I was just a little curious because how much of Ambedkar's thought on Buddhism is getting influence from Ashoka's thought on Buddhism, and if at all there are any parallels or similarities between the two, because many centuries ago, Ashoka had already left quite a bit in the just to propagate and spread
Yeah.
Buddhism all over India among the common people. So I was just wanting to, and I'm curious, I don't know if there is enough literature on this or not because I have not really searched it by myself, but while you were addressing, I was thinking how much of the thought of Ambedkar is being shaped from Ashokan Buddhist.
Yeah, and Ashoka left, as I understand it, basically just as edicts, because they were carved on rock. That's the way to get your articles remembered. So yeah, it wasn't volumes of text, but it was very important. And in the history that people today are still recovering about Ashoka, or trying to imagine, because sometimes you don't have the documents. So Ashoka was this incredibly important Buddhist figure for Ambedkar. And one of the, I think it was in Bhagavan Das's biography, but one of these people that wrote down their memories of Ambedkar, they came to Ambedkar's house. Everyone came to his house in the 50s and 40s, and they would ask him questions or seek favors, small things, big things, whatever. And one of them came and let Ambedkar know, that he's getting married, and can I have your blessing? And so Ambedkar sent one of his servants into his library to get him a copy of Ashoka's edicts for a wedding gift. And so he said, "That's my advice for your wedding." And so, so it's fascinating. So yeah, you see in those kind of physical acts, he valued Ashoka's edicts, or at least he didn't want the book around. No, I think he did this as a good thing. And so, I got to dig deeper on that. There's one of those pictures I had on my slideshow was him in front of a Columbia banner and an American flag. That was in like 1954. Columbia had some kind of event over in Delhi. And seated next to him, I don't know if you see it in the picture, was McKeon, who was a pragmatist in his own right. And McKeon in those years was doing this UN project, UNESCO project about democracy, and he gave these lectures all over, had these like forums all over India. And I've got all the books that McKeon, had published after this. I don't see Ambedkar in there, but Ambedkar was literally at the same table. McKeon also, with an Indian author, translated Ashoka's edicts in the 50s in a small volume. So there's these interesting stories that I'm just giving you the tidbits of, but I can't give you definitive answers. But Ambedkar was definitely interested in Ashoka. Oh yeah, Dave, you had your hand up.
Oh, well, you kind of walked away into it. You mentioned in Ambedkar's library, he had four copies of Democracy and Education, yet only one of Experience in Nature. Now, apparently he couldn't get rid of Democracy and Education. But I was actually curious as to, the small question is, why four? What are the provenances of them? Are they annotated differently?
Yeah.
But the larger questions are, and I haven't heard so far, you're talking about Ambedkar's philosophy of education and how well it lines up with Dewey. And the larger question is, how does education appear in that constitution that Ambedkar with such a principle.
Yeah. I don't know the question about it is the world's longest constitution. It has something like 200 amendments. It's you can amend by just majority vote in the Raj Sabha or whatever. But at any rate, it's so I stay away from that. People like Nussbaum engage that aspect. But his philosophy of education is fascinating. He would say things at various parts about caste taking away educational opportunities. And so there's more to be said on that. Suffice it to say, he doesn't author a book just on education. It's going to be part of his critique of caste. He engages in parliamentary debates, like when he was a Mumbai kind of legislator, about the educational purposes of the University of Mumbai, so you start to see it. So you definitely get this idea that he's for education. Now, what's he for? This is what's fascinating. Right when he came back from the West, and he slowly got into his own. Like I said, he couldn't find housing in 1918, and eventually he starts getting comfortable enough and successful enough to run activist campaigns. But he starts in 1924 to start an educational society, and it flopped within a year. But other ones he started lasted. But that first one, we have his constitution for it. And what's he doing? He's starting hostels. He's starting, because untouchables can't find places to stay. He's starting, libraries. He's starting organizations to give educative plays to these people. So it's very much in the line of holistic education that folks like Jane Addams would say, is what immigrants or oppressed or whoever needs. And there's also a story there that I'm slowly digging on. It did not appear in the book, it'll appear later. But Ambedkar took 5 classes from Vladimir Simkovich at Columbia University. Matter of fact, that's why he didn't take that second psychology ethics. He took Simkovich's class about Marxism and socialism. And so, if you have to understand Ambedkar and Marxism, think about Dewey's objections to Marx on means and ends, and think about Simkovich's arguments against his economic theory and deterministic. So these lie behind Ambedkar's view of Marxism in many ways. But Simkovich's wife was Mary Kingsbury Simkovich, who ran Greenwich House down in Greenwich Village. She was good friends with Adams. And, in all her books, she says she had visitors from Japan, China, India. I've looked through all the visitor cards I can find there that start after Ambedkar's time, but no names are Indian. There's many Syrian names, but there's no Indian names. And so I'm convinced that he knew about the settlement house through Vladimir. Vladimir and Mary lived down there on the weekdays, at Greenwich House. And Vladimir took his class down there, supposedly. And so I'm convinced that some of the moves he makes with this kind of view of hostels and settlement activities comes from what he saw in New York, comes from people that were in the orbit of Dewey. Simkovich and Dewey was on her board and such. And so there's this fascinating integration of things that go on in India and things that were going on in Manhattan at the time that just is waiting to be told. And the books question, I don't know. They're different annotation strategies. So, for instance, one version of Democracy and Education is paperback, probably from '48. I can't get to it because they couldn't find the key for the locked cabinet. So this is research in India. They said, "Oh, we'll find it later and send you a pic." I'm like, okay, but some cultures you never say no and disappoint someone. But I doubt it's heavily marked up. The 2 earliest ones, 1916, 1925, those editions are heavily marked up, different patterns. And I think that 25 one was probably marked up in the 30s or 40s when he was getting ready to start at Siddhartha College in 46. The other one's markings are the kinds of things he draws right into Annihilation of Caste in 36, which he's probably writing the year before there. So this is interesting to think about, is when we read and mark, we're doing this purposively. Can we divine those purposes? This is so much better than assuming that if you had a book, you understood it all and you absorbed it all and all of it influenced you. So it's an interesting kind of challenge of interpretation. Thank you all for listening.
All right.